to 10, Allie said, I suppose I'm a 7. But you, on the other hand, I estimate you to be about a 3. She could tell that it stung, mainly because it was true. 7's not worth looking at, he said. And the way I see it, we're not going to have to look at each other much longer, are we? What's that supposed to mean? Said Nick, who did not like the sound of it any more than Allie did. Johnny O crossed his arms, making his oversized hands seem even larger compared to his small chest. A single piece of gum don't buy you passage over my territory, he said. He turned to Nick. Which means you gots to be my servant now. We'll do no such thing, said Allie. I wasn't talking to you. We don't need the likes of you around here. Well, said Allie, I'm not going without him. And the others laughed. Oh, said Raggedy Andy, I don't think he'll want to go where you're going. Allie didn't quite know what that meant, but even so, she started to panic. Grab her, Johnny-O ordered his comrades. Allie knew she had to think of something quick, and so she said the first thing that came to mind. Stay away from me, or I'll call the McGill. That stopped them dead in their tracks. What are you talking about? Said Johnny-O, not as sure of himself as he was a second ago. You heard me, Allie yelled. The McGill and I have a special arrangement. It comes when I call it, and I feed it bad little thieves whose hands are bigger than their brains. She's lying, said another kid who hadn't spoken until now, probably because he had such a nasty, squeaky voice. Johnny-O looked all irritated. Of course she's lying. He looked at Allie and then back at the quiet kid. So how do you know she's lying? She's a green soul. Probably just crossed over, the squeaky kid said. Which means she hasn't even seen the McGill. Besides, said Purple Puss, no one sees the McGill and lives. Except for her, said Nick, figuring out his own angle on the situation. That's why I stay with her. As long as I'm with her, the McGill protects me too. So what's it look like? Johnny-O said, looking closely at Allie, trying to read the bluff in her face. Well, I could tell you, she said, using one of her father's favorite lines, but then I'd have to kill you. The others laughed at that, and so Johnny-O curled his heavy hand into a fist and smashed the closest kid for laughing. He flew back about 5 feet. Then Johnny-O got closer to Allie again. I think you're lying, he said. Guess you'll just have to find out, Allie taunted back. Touch me, and I'll call the McGill. Johnny-O hesitated. He looked at Allie, looked at Nick, then looked at the boys around him. His authority had been challenged, and Allie realized too late that she should have figured another bluff, one that would allow this little creep to keep his dignity, because a kid like this would rather risk getting eaten by a monster than be disrespected by a girl. He looked at her square in the eye and said, You're going down. With that, he snapped his fingers, a dry, brittle sound like a cracking plate. Then 3 kids grabbed her, pulled her off the dead spot, put her down on the living roadway, and began to lean heavily on her shoulders. In an instant, she had sunk into the asphalt up to her knees, and an instant later, up to her waist. No! She screamed. McGill! McGill! She called. It only gave them a brief moment's pause, and when the beast did not materialize out of thin air, they kept on pushing. Now it was easier for them, with Allie in up to her waist. Nick struggled and kicked against the hands holding him, but it was no use. All he could do was watch as the others leaned and pressed on Allie's shoulders, pushing her deeper and deeper into the ground. Soon, her shoulders disappeared, and she was up to her neck, and still she was screaming hysterically now, and Johnny-O just laughed. Let me do the honors, he said, and with that, he came over, grabbed her on the top of the head, and began to push down. Enjoy the trip, he said. Don't bother riding. And then another voice entered the fray. A high-pitched scream came out of nowhere, and a figure burst onto the scene, arms flailing wildly. The McGill! Shouted one of the other boys. The McGill! Again, that squealing war cry, and then Allie heard no more of it, for her ears and her eyes and the top of her head had sunk into the asphalt. Johnny-O had stopped pushing, but gravity was doing the rest. The earth had her like quicksand, and she was going down. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was completely muffled by the earth filling it. The earth had swallowed her, and the feeling of it in her chest, in the place where her lungs should have been, was more awful than anything she could remember, and it dawned on her that this could very well be her eternity. She was on her way to the center of the earth. How deep was she beneath the surface of the road now? 6 inches? 6 feet? She forced her arms to move, using every ounce of strength she had. It was like swimming in molasses. She forced one hand up high and tried to haul herself upward, but it did no good. Then, just before all hope left her, someone reached down out of nowhere, grabbed her hand, and pulled. She felt herself sliding upward inch by inch. She forced her other hand up through the asphalt until her fingertips brushed the cool air, and someone grasped onto that hand as well. She moved up and could feel the top of her head and her eyes and her ears clearing, and finally her mouth, and she released the scream that had been held back by the dirt and the rocks like a gag in her mouth. Had Johnny-O and his gang changed their minds? Or was this the monster that she had summoned out of the woods, pulling her out of the earth only to devour her? But with her eyes clear, she could now see into the face of her savior. "Leaf? Are you okay?" Leaf said. "I thought you were lost for sure." Nick was there too, and together, the both of them pulled until Allie came out and landed on the solid ground of the dead spot. She collapsed in a heap, breathing heavily, and Leaf looked at her strangely. I know, said Allie. "I don't have to be out of breath, but I want to be. It feels right." "It's okay," said Leaf. "Maybe someday you can teach me to feel that way again." "Where's Johnny-O and his cast of morons?" Allie asked. "Gone," Nick told her. "They were so freaked out when Leaf came charging out at them, they took off." Leaf laughed. "They really thought I was the McGill. Ain't that a hoot and a half?" Leaf began to pull ghost weeds from beneath the "Welcome to Rockland County" sign and used their stalks to repair his road shoes, which must have broken when he charged Johnny-O. "Have you been following us all this time?" Allie asked. Leaf shrugged. "Well, yeah. I had to make sure you didn't get eaten by no monsters, didn't I?" "Great," said Nick. "We've got our own guardian angel. If I were an angel, I wouldn't be here, would I?" Allie smiled. After all these years, Leaf had left his forest for them. It could not have been a choice he made lightly, and so she vowed to herself that from this moment on, she would look out for him in any way she could. They didn't wait until dawn, figuring Johnny-O and his gang might come back. Rather than being troubled by the encounter, Allie found herself heartened by it. Nick was his usual gloom and doom, talking about the Lord of the Flies and dangers of rogue bands of parentless kids, but even in his worry, there was a new energy, because running into Johnny-O proved that there were lots of afterlights around. Not all of them would be as unpleasant as Johnny-O's gang. They came to the Hudson River and stayed on the highway that ran along the Palisades, sheer cliffs carved by the relentless glaciers of the last ice age which lined the western shore of the river. Traffic became denser, but they bore it no mind, not caring if the occasional car passed through them. In fact, for a while they tried to make a game of it, trying to figure out what song was playing on the radio during the brief instant each car sped through. "The things we dead folk do to amuse ourselves," Allie said, heaving a heavy sigh. The game didn't last long, mainly because Leaf, who had never heard a car radio, much less rock and roll, felt increasingly left out. By sunset of the next day, the cheese grater gridwork of the George Washington Bridge appeared downriver, heralding their arrival in New York City. Leaf was overwhelmed by the sight of the great city looming before him. It was a clear day and the whole skyline could be seen from across the river. Leaf had been to New York before, twice. Once for the 4th of July, and once for Mr. P.T. Barnum's circus. There were tall buildings, to be sure, but none like these. Nick and Allie stared as well. Leaf assumed they were also in awe of the spectacular view. In truth, they were awed, but for an entirely different reason. "I think I know where we should go," Nick said, a strange hollowness to his voice. Allie didn't answer him for a while. "Manhattan is out of our way," Allie finally said. "We should stay on this side of the river and keep heading south." Nick looked to the city again. "I don't care what you say. I'm taking a detour." This time, Allie didn't argue. Night had fallen by the time they reached the Manhattan side of the bridge. It took the whole night without rest to make it to the heart of the city. The towers of Midtown Manhattan would have taken Leaf's breath away, if he indeed had breath to be stolen. But the most wondrous sights of all were the two silver towers he saw glimmering in the light of dawn as they neared the southern tip of the city. The two towers were identical monoliths, steel and glass twins reflecting a silvery light of daybreak. "I never knew buildings like that existed," Leaf said. Allie sighed. "They don't exist," she said. "At least, not anymore." Leaf could tell the sadness in her voice went straight down to the center of the earth.